In the late 1700s, a young clerk could sail to Calcutta with nothing, spend a decade in the East India Company's counting houses, and come home in his 20s or 30s so wealthy he never had to work again. The British called men like this nabobs, and did not mean it kindly, envy wearing the mask of scorn, aimed at boys who had somehow found the door marked early and walked through it before anyone thought they were allowed to. Most people who manage the same trick are quieter than that, and the habits behind it are older than clerks, older than Calcutta, older in some cases than money itself. What follows moves through the documented habits of people across history who arranged their lives to be finished with earning long before old age caught up with them. The ledgers they kept from boyhood, the offices they refused to bow for, the fortunes they built and the ones they walked away from on purpose, and the misquotes and word histories that still carry old thrift folded inside ordinary words like budget and nest egg. One habit further and quietly decides, more than any other here, who ends up with their own time back and who does not. None of it is instruction. This is not a channel that tells anyone what to do with their money, only one that watches, closely and calmly, what history's clerks and philosophers and misers and emperors actually did with theirs, and leaves the pattern to speak for itself. He kept the habit for over 70 years, long after the notebook itself had become a relic behind glass. In 1855, at 16, John D. Rockefeller took a job as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a small produce commission firm on the Cleveland docks, earning $6 a week. Almost immediately, he spent 10 cents on a small notebook and titled its first page Ledger A. Into it went every cent that passed through his hands: wages, streetcar fares, church collections, small loans to family. He was not yet rich. He was not yet anyone in particular. He was a teenager with a column for income and a column for outflow, and a habit of closing the gap between them with sums small enough to seem barely worth writing down. One line of that ledger recorded a decision he kept for the rest of his life, a fixed tenth of his earnings set aside for his church, a practice he had learned at home and never abandoned, whether he was clearing $6 a week or decades later, sums no ledger page could hold. Ledger A survives today, preserved among his papers, its ruled columns filled in a careful, unhurried hand that does not look like the hand of a man in a hurry to get rich. That is part of what makes it strange to read now. The habit did not scale up dramatically as the money did. It simply continued, the same discipline applied to numbers that kept adding zeros. Standard Oil, the refineries, the controlling grip on American oil that made him the richest man alive, all of that came later, sometimes much later. The ledger came first, when there was almost nothing to track and no reason to think there ever would be much more. Historians who have studied Rockefeller's early years point to this order of operations more than to any particular business genius. The record-keeping predates the fortune, not the reverse. Whether the habit caused the wealth or merely accompanied a temperament suited to both is not something the ledger can answer. It only shows a boy at a produce firm, cent by cent, teaching himself to know exactly where his money was. A cheap notebook outlasted the company that gave him his first paycheck by more than a century. A German writer named H.Y.N. Rick Burrell published a short parable in 1963 that has been retold in business seminars and philosophy classrooms ever since, usually by people trying to explain what enough actually means. A well-dressed tourist, vacationing on a European coast, comes across a fisherman dozing beside his boat in the early afternoon. The tourist, troubled by what looks like wasted potential, wakes him with a string of questions. Why are not you out fishing longer? The fisherman explains that his morning catch was already enough to cover today and tomorrow. Undeterred, the tourist lays out a plan. Fish longer hours, buy a second boat, then a fleet, hire a crew, build a small cannery, move to the city, oversee an empire of trawlers and processing plants, and eventually, the tourist says, his eyes brightening, you could retire early, move back to this quiet coast, sleep late, take your boat out for a short morning row, and spend your afternoons dozing in the sun by the harbor. The fisherman looks at him and says that this is exactly what he is doing right now. Burrell gave the story a title that translates roughly as an anecdote concerning the decline of the work ethic, and its structure is almost mathematically clean. the tourist's entire elaborate plan for the future turns out to describe the fisherman's actual Tuesday. Nothing about the story tells the listener which man is right. The tourist's plan is not mocked outright. Expansion, ambition, and the accumulation of boats are treated as a real and coherent way to live, just one that happens to arrive, after decades of effort, at a destination the fisherman reached by declining to leave it. Burl wrote the piece during West Germany's post-war economic boom, a period celebrated for its relentless productivity, and the parable reads partly as a quiet needle aimed at that mood. It keeps resurfacing decades later, translated and adapted, retold at conferences about ambition and burnout. Precisely because it refuses to hand its audience a moral. It just leaves the tourist standing on the beach, doing the arithmetic again in his head. The fisherman goes back to sleep. The tourist is the one who walks away thinking. In 1571, at 38, Michel de Montaigne sold his seat in the Parliament of Bordeaux, stepped back from public office, and had a Latin inscription carved into the wall of a round stone tower on his family estate, announcing his retreat into what he called the bosom of the learned virgins, his private term for a life of study. He was not fleeing ruin. He came from comfortable minor nobility, had served competently as a magistrate, and could have continued climbing. He simply judged that phase of his life finished. The tower he chose was the estate's old defensive keep, 3 stories built into the corner of the chateau walls. On the ground floor sat a chapel, the middle floor held his bedroom, and at the top, reached by a narrow stair, was his library, a round room lined with roughly 1,000 books, its wooden beams carved with sayings from ancient philosophers he read and reread. He walked its floor while composing, dictated to no one, and kept irregular hours. Out of that room came the Essays, a sprawling, self-interrogating book unlike anything European readers had encountered. Chapters on cannibals, on thumbs, on the education of children, on his own kidney stones, all circling the same unglamorous question of how to live and die honestly. He revised it for the rest of his life, adding new layers in the margins, until his death in 1592. He never fully withdrew from public affairs. He later served as mayor of Bordeaux and negotiated between warring factions during France's religious wars. But the tower remained his base, the place he returned to when the negotiating was done. What he stepped away from in 1571 was not work itself, but a particular office, a particular ladder, at a moment when he judged he had climbed it enough. 4.5 centuries later, magistrates do not typically own towers, and few of us will leave behind a shelf of essays. But the outline of the decision, that a career can be declared finished by the person living it rather than by circumstance, has aged less than almost anything else about the 16th century. The tower is still there in the French countryside, its beams still carved with the words he chose to read every day. In the autumn of the year 405, a minor Chinese official named Tao Yuanming was serving as magistrate of Pengze, a small county post he had held for roughly 80 days, when word came that a superior's inspector was arriving, and that protocol required the magistrate to dress formally and bow before him. Accounts describe Tao's response less as an outburst than as a quiet refusal. He is remembered as saying that he would not bend at the waist for 5 pecks of rice, the modest grain salary that was his official pay, then removed his official seal and robes and walked home. He never again held government office. Tao had drifted in and out of minor administrative posts for years before this, torn between the income such positions provided and a temperament that found their formalities suffocating. 5 pecks of rice a month was not nothing. It was a real, if modest, livelihood, and giving it up meant real hardship for his household. Records and his own poems describe lean years that followed, harvests that failed, and stretches close to hunger. What he gained instead was time on a small farm south of the mountains, where he grew beans and grain with mixed success, drank home-brewed wine when he could afford it, and wrote poetry that would eventually place him among the most celebrated poets in Chinese literary history. His verses from this period are plain, almost anti-heroic, filled with weeds overtaking bean rows and clothes soaked with dew, alongside a recurring, unhurried satisfaction with having chosen the plow over the bow. He wrote of returning to his fields as though returning to something long owed to himself, describing his years in office as a bird kept in a cage that had finally found its way back to the forest. Later generations of scholars and poets, many of whom held the same kind of official posts he abandoned, kept returning to his example as the standard case of a person who weighed status and salary against autonomy and chose the smaller number. His fields eventually failed more often than they succeeded, and he is remembered anyway for the bow he refused to make. An old fable, told in several versions across Persian and Indian sources for over 1,000 years, describes a courtier presenting a king with a new game played on a board of 64 squares. The king, delighted, asks what reward the inventor would like. The courtier asks for something that sounds almost like a joke: 1 grain of wheat on the first square, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, each square holding double the one before it, all the way to the 64th. The king, amused by the modesty of the request, agrees at once and orders his treasurer to count it out. The early squares cost nothing worth noticing: a handful of grain, then a cupful, then a small sack. But doubling is a strange kind of growth, quiet for a long time and then suddenly not. By the halfway point of the board, the count has already climbed into the millions. By the last few squares, no granary in the kingdom, no harvest across every field the king owns, could supply what is owed. The full total, tallied by later mathematicians working out the story's arithmetic, comes to a number of grains so large it would outweigh anything the ancient world could plausibly grow in 1,000 years. Some versions of the tale end with the king humbled and impressed, elevating the clever courtier to advisor. Other, older versions end darker, with a king who realizes he has been outwitted and has the man executed rather than pay the debt. The story is often linked to the invention of chess itself, sometimes credited to a sage in India offering the game to a ruler as a gift, though the historical origins of both the game and the fable are tangled and not fully traceable to one source. What has outlasted any single version of the story is the arithmetic at its center, a rule so simple a child can follow it on the first few squares, and so explosive by the last few that it breaks the imagination of anyone hearing it for the first time. Each square only ever does one thing: double what came before, and that alone turns out to be enough. The board has 64 squares. The kingdom, as the story tells it, did not have enough wheat in the world to fill the last one. 2 officials arrived at the riverbank where the philosopher Zhuangzi was fishing, sent by the king of Chu to offer him command of the state's entire administration, a position of enormous wealth and standing. Zhuangzi did not look up right away. He asked them whether they had heard of the sacred tortoise, dead now 3,000 years, that the king kept wrapped in cloth inside a chest, venerated in the ancestral temple. Then he asked his real question: would that tortoise, given the choice, rather be dead and honored in that temple, or alive and dragging its tail through the mud? The officials answered without much hesitation that it would rather be alive, dragging its tail through the mud. "Then you may go," Zhuangzi told them, "because that is where I intend to keep dragging mine." The exchange survives in the Taoist text that carries his name, compiled from his teachings and the school that grew around them, and it is one of the sharper anecdotes in a book built almost entirely out of anecdotes, parables, and arguments conducted through animals and tradesmen rather than kings and ministers. Zhuangzi lived in the 4th century before the Common Era, a minor official himself for part of his life before turning away from court service altogether, and the tortoise story is usually read as his clearest statement of why. High office in the Chu court would have meant wealth, ceremony, a title that outlived him. It would also have meant a life spent as an ornament of state, consulted and displayed rather than left alone, bound by the very honors that made the position desirable. The mud, by contrast, offered nothing anyone would carve an inscription about. It also offered his own hours, unclaimed by anyone else's schedule, and a river he could sit beside without asking permission. The text does not record what the officials said on the walk back to report their failure. Somewhere in Chu, a chest still held a dead tortoise wrapped in cloth, and a live one kept fishing. According to the stories later writers told about him, and it should be said that not every detail of an ancient life like his survives with full certainty. The philosopher Diogenes of Sinope owned almost nothing: a coarse cloak worn double as blanket and coat, a staff, a bag for scraps of food, and a large wooden storage tub he used in place of a house. One story, repeated across several ancient sources with enough consistency to suggest a real kernel beneath it, describes him watching a boy drink water by cupping his hands together, and concluding on the spot that he had been carrying an unnecessary possession. He took the wooden cup that was by then one of his only belongings and threw it away. He had arrived in Athens, by most accounts, after a coin-defacing scandal drove him from his home city, and rather than quietly rebuild a respectable life, he turned poverty into a kind of public performance, testing in the street how little a person actually required against how much a person was told they required. The most famous story about him involves Alexander the Great, then the most powerful man in the known world, who sought Diogenes out and, finding him resting outside his tub, offered to grant him any favor he wished to name. Diogenes is said to have asked him only to step aside, since he was blocking the sun. Alexander, by the account handed down, was not offended. He is said to have remarked that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. Whether every word of that exchange happened exactly as written, no one alive can verify. But the shape of it recurs across independent ancient sources, which is usually as close to confirmation as antiquity offers. What Diogenes seems to have been demonstrating, tub and cloak and thrown-away cup all pointing the same direction, was not poverty for its own sake, but a kind of arithmetic in reverse. Most people totaled up what they might gain, while he was totaling up what he could stand to lose, and finding the number smaller than expected. Alexander offered him the world, in effect, and the only thing Diogenes wanted from him was to move a few feet to the left. The philosopher Epicurus did not preach indulgence, whatever his name later came to imply. Around 307 before the Common Era, he bought a house with a garden on the outskirts of Athens and moved in with a small community of friends and students, men and women alike, who shared meals, shared work, and shared a fairly austere daily life built around bread, water, and conversation rather than feasting. The community became known simply as the Garden, and it operated for centuries after his death as something between a philosophical school and a household. At the center of Epicurus' teaching was a habit of sorting desires before acting on them, dividing every want into one of three categories. Some desires are natural and necessary: food enough to end hunger, shelter, rest, the basic maintenance of a body and mind. Some are natural but not necessary: a taste for a particular fine meal rather than plain bread, a preference easy enough to enjoy occasionally and easy enough to live without. And some desires, in his accounting, are neither natural nor necessary at all: wealth piled beyond any use, fame, status competitions with no natural stopping point, wants invented by comparison with other people, rather than arising from the body's own requirements. Sorting a want into the third category did not mean condemning whoever chased it. It meant noting that this particular want, unlike hunger or cold, had no built-in ending, and so could never actually be satisfied by getting more of it. History was not kind to the precision of this system. Within a few centuries, Epicurus' name had drifted into a byword for the opposite of what he taught: a rich man's dinner described as Epicurean, a wine list called Epicurean. The word absorbed into exactly the kind of status display his sorting was designed to flag as bottomless. The garden itself is gone, its exact location in Athens lost to time. What survives is the sorting method, still occasionally rediscovered by people trying to work out, in their own accounting, which of their wants have an ending and which do not. A philosophy built on knowing when a want is satisfied ended up lending its name to the idea that no want ever is. The Romans had a word for leisure that had been rightfully earned: otium, and it meant something entirely different from having nothing to do. A man's negotium, his busyness, his public duties and business dealings, was what bought him the right to otium, and he was expected to know exactly when the balance had tipped in his favor. Pliny the Younger left behind letters that describe in some detail what he actually did with his otium once he had earned it. He kept a villa on the shore of Lake Como, and his mornings there followed a fixed shape. He walked, he dictated letters and drafts to a secretary, he read. Afternoons belonged to friends, to conversation, to more books. None of this reads as idleness in his own account, because idleness, otiositas or simple sloth, was not otium at all. It was its disreputable cousin. the thing a serious Roman was supposed to avoid. Otium had to be justified by the negotium that preceded it. A senator who had served his terms, argued his cases, and managed his estates had in the Roman reckoning purchased the right to withdraw to his villa and write poetry or study philosophy without shame. A young man who had done none of that and simply lounged was something closer to a wastrel. This meant a wealthy Roman lived with a kind of running ledger in his head, not of money exactly, but of obligation discharged against leisure claimed. Cicero wrote about the tension constantly, torn between the pull of otium and the demands of public life, sometimes praising retreat and sometimes calling it a retreat from duty, depending on his mood and his politics. The rhythm was rarely as clean as the philosophy suggested. Wars, trials, and elections in Rome had a way of summoning men back from their lake houses, whether their internal accounting said they were owed more time away or not. Still, the idea persisted for centuries. Rest was not a right simply granted by being alive. It was something earned through work, tracked, and then spent deliberately, in full view of one's peers, who were keeping their own tallies too. A villa on a quiet lake, built and furnished by decades of work, most of its visitors never saw. Hetty Green ran one of the largest fortunes in America from a series of rented rooms, wearing a black dress so worn that clerks who dealt with her for years sometimes mistook her for a beggar. By the time she died in 1916, she was likely the richest woman in the country, with a net worth well over $100 million. The newspapers of her day gave her a nickname, the Witch of Wall Street, and built a whole genre of stories around her thrift. That she refused to pay for hot water, that she argued over pennies at the pharmacy, that she let her son's leg injury go untreated too long because she was hunting for a free clinic. Some of these stories are documented, others are harder to verify, and the press of the era had every incentive to make a wealthy woman working alone in a man's business look strange rather than shrewd. What is well documented is what she did with her days, which had little to do with pinching pennies for their own sake, and everything to do with moving large sums carefully. During the Panic of 1907, when banks were failing and credit had seized up across the country, Hetty Green lent money to New York City itself, helping the government meet its obligations when few others would extend it credit on reasonable terms. She built her fortune methodically in real estate, railroads, and mortgages, holding cash reserves that let her buy when panicked sellers needed a buyer and prices had fallen furthest. Modern biographers and historians looking back at her life have started to ask whether the miser reputation the hostile press built around her was ever entirely fair, or whether a woman succeeding at a scale few men matched simply made a better villain than a competent financier. Her frugality was real, but so was her willingness to keep the city of New York solvent when men in finer clothes were unwilling to take the risk. She kept the ledgers herself, in a dress she had already owned for years, and the numbers came out ahead every time. In 1861, the British government opened the Post Office Savings Bank, and for the first time, a person could walk into almost any post office in the country and deposit as little as a single shilling into an account that earned interest. The point was not the interest. The point was the habit. Before the Post Office Savings Bank existed, someone earning a modest wage had almost no safe place to put a few spare coins between paydays. Commercial banks were built around merchants and men of property, with account minimums and formalities that put them out of reach for laborers, domestic servants, and factory workers. Savings banks for the poor had existed here and there earlier in the century, run by charities and local trustees, but they were scattered and inconsistent. The post office, by contrast, already had a building in nearly every town and village in Britain, staffed and trusted, and turning those counters into savings windows meant the infrastructure for small-scale saving suddenly existed almost everywhere at once. A shilling deposited on a Friday was recorded in a passbook the depositor carried home, a small paper record of money set aside rather than spent. The idea did not stay in Britain. Other countries watched the British system and adapted it over the following decades, building their own postal savings networks on the same basic logic. Use an existing government network to reach savers that banks had no interest in serving. The United States came to it comparatively late, opening its own postal savings system in 1911, 50 years after Britain, aimed particularly at immigrant communities who distrusted commercial banks after waves of failures, but trusted the post office because their home countries often ran similar systems already. What is easy to miss in the numbers is the intent behind them. Governments building these systems were not chasing profit from the deposits. The interest they paid out was modest, sometimes barely above nothing. They had decided that a population in the habit of setting money aside, even small amounts, even irregularly, was worth building an entire institution to encourage. A shilling, recorded in a passbook, was never really about the shilling. In 1909, a bank treasurer in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, named Merkel Landis, opened a new kind of account, one built on a strange condition. Depositors could put money in whenever they liked, but they could not touch it again until December. By the end of that first year, 350 people had signed up to have their own money held out of their own reach. The Christmas Club, as it came to be called, worked on a simple mechanic. A saver would commit to depositing a small amount, often 50 cents or $1, on a regular schedule throughout the year. The bank would hold the total, paying little or no interest on it, and hand it back as a single lump sum shortly before the holidays, timed precisely for the season when household spending spiked hardest. There was no way to withdraw early without losing the arrangement entirely. That restriction, rather than discouraging depositors, appears to have been the entire appeal. Word of the idea spread quickly. Other banks in Pennsylvania picked it up within a few years, and by the 1920s, Christmas clubs had become a fixture at banks across the United States, with millions of dollars flowing through them by the middle of the century. Banks liked the clubs because they brought in depositors, some of whom would open other accounts once they were already walking through the door each week. Depositors seemed to like the clubs for a different reason entirely. The accounts solved a problem plain willpower kept failing to solve on its own. What the Christmas Club suggests about saving is not flattering to the idea that people simply decide to save and then do it. Here were hundreds of thousands of ordinary depositors, and eventually millions, willingly paying a bank the price of zero or near zero interest and total inaccessibility, in exchange for a guarantee that their own future selves would not be allowed to spend the money early. They were not lending the bank money so much as hiring it as a lock, a tool built to protect people from no one but themselves. Turned out to be one of the most popular financial products of its era. The money was always theirs, they simply were not allowed to have it yet. In the version of Aesop's fable that most people remember, a grasshopper sings through the summer while an ant works, and when winter comes, the ant survives on its stores while the grasshopper starves at the ant's door. It is one of the most repeated morality tales about money in the Western tradition. It is also, in its earliest tellings, far less settled than the version that survived. Ancient and medieval retellers of the ant and the grasshopper did not all agree on how the story should end, or even on what the grasshopper's summer had been worth. Some versions have the ants relenting and sharing their stores with the grasshopper anyway, softening the fable from a warning into something closer to a lesson about mercy alongside prudence. Other tellings frame the grasshopper singing itself as a kind of labor, a contribution of beauty or music that the strict ledger of the harvest fails to account for, which raises the fable's real question rather than answering it. Is a life spent making something uncountable, like song, actually a life spent doing nothing? La Fontaine's 17th century French retelling leans hard into the ant's coldness, and some readers over the centuries have come away from it disliking the ant more than the grasshopper, uneasy at the sight of comfortable stores withheld from a starving neighbor over the winter. The fable has been retold across roughly 2,000 years, translated, moralized, illustrated, and occasionally inverted, and each culture's choice about how to end it works like a small confession. A version that ends in the grasshopper's death is a culture insisting that foresight is owed to no one but oneself. A version that ends with the ants sharing is a culture unwilling to let prudence curdle into cruelty. A version that finds worth in the grasshopper's song is a culture unwilling to measure a life only in stores laid by. None of these endings is the original in any pure sense, because the fable was never a fixed object. It was a question handed down, reshaped by whoever happened to be answering it. 2 insects, 1 story, and 2,000 years of arguing over which of them had it right. In 1913, A cartoonist named Pop Momand introduced a comic strip about a family straining to match the lifestyle of the family next door. A neighbor the reader was never actually shown. Momand had lived through the situation himself. He and his wife had gone into debt trying to keep pace with wealthier neighbors in Cedarhurst, New York, before retreating to a smaller, cheaper apartment in Manhattan to recover. The strip followed the McGinnis family, ordinary and financially strained, forever measuring themselves against a neighboring household named the Joneses, whose lawns, cars, and parties were always somehow one step ahead. Readers never saw the Joneses directly. That absence was the strip's quiet joke and its lasting insight. The family being chased barely mattered as a family at all, because the comparison was doing all the work, regardless of who was on the other side of the fence. Momand's own Cedarhurst experience had taught him the same lesson the hard way, watching his own household spending climb to match neighbors he was not particularly close to and did not need to impress, until the climbing became the problem, rather than any specific purchase. Keeping Up with the Joneses ran in newspapers for 25 years, syndicated across the country, entertaining readers with a family's minor humiliations delivered weekly. The comic strip itself eventually ended and faded from most readers' memory. The phrase it created did not. It slipped out of the funny pages and into ordinary conversation, still doing steady work in magazine articles and dinner table conversations more than a century after Momand first drew it, long after most people using the phrase had any idea it once had an author, a strip, or a fictional family named the McGinnises attached to it. The neighbors people measure themselves against most often are exactly like the Joneses, half-glimpsed, imagined, assembled more from guesswork than from any real accounting of what is actually behind their fence. When Germany created the world's first state old age pension in 1889, the qualifying age was set at 70. Popular memory has largely replaced that number with 65, the age Germany actually lowered the threshold to almost 30 years later in 1916. The pension is often described, accurately in outline but loosely in detail, as a benefit few workers of the era could realistically expect to collect, since life expectancy at birth in Germany at the time hovered near 40. That framing overstates the case more than it first appears to. Average life expectancy at birth is dragged down heavily by infant and child mortality, which was steep in the 19th century, and a worker who had already survived childhood, held a job, and reached adulthood had considerably better odds of living into his 60s or 70s than the raw birth year figure suggests on its own. The pension was demanding, certainly, and plenty of workers died before collecting a shilling of it. It was not the near impossible finish line the popular retelling sometimes implies. What makes 1889 worth remembering has less to do with the exact age than with the idea itself, a government fixing by law a specific age at which a working life was formally considered over, and attaching a guaranteed payment to it. Before this, old age support for laborers had been a patchwork of family obligation, charity, church almshouses, and whatever savings a worker had managed to put by, with no floor beneath any of it. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck's government built the pension as part of a broader set of social insurance laws, aimed as much at giving workers a stake in the stability of the state as at any purely humanitarian concern. Whatever the mixture of motives, the mechanism itself, a fixed retirement age written into law with a payment attached, was new in the world in 1889, and the number attached to it, 70, was the original, even if it is 65 that people now remember. The number people repeat, and the number that was actually written into law, turned out decades later to be two different ages entirely. The Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto is often said to have stumbled onto his famous 80-20 pattern by counting peas in his garden, watching a small number of pods produce most of the harvest. The documented research behind the idea looks nothing like that. In 1896, Pareto published a study of land ownership in Italy and found that a small share of the population held the great majority of it. The pea pod story gets repeated constantly in business books, keynote speeches, and productivity blogs, usually as a charming bit of color before the 80-20 rule gets applied to sales figures or customer complaints. Historians and researchers who have gone looking for the origin of that pea story have never turned up a source anywhere near Pareto's own lifetime. The earliest known versions of it surfaced decades after his death, which strongly suggests it was invented well after the fact, likely by 20th century business writers looking for a vivid image to hang an abstract statistical finding on. Pareto himself, so far as the documented record shows, never wrote about counting peas at all. What he did write about was land. His 1896 study, part of a broader body of work on income and wealth distribution across several European countries, showed the same lopsided pattern turning up again and again. A minority of landholders controlling a majority of the land, a minority of earners controlling a majority of the income. He was not trying to produce a punchy productivity slogan. He was trying to describe, with the statistical tools available to him at the time, how unevenly ownership and income actually distributed themselves in the societies he studied, a finding with real and sometimes uncomfortable implications for how 19th century Europe was structured. The garden story survived because it is simple, visual, and easy to repeat at a podium, while a table of Italian land ownership figures from 1896 is none of those things. Somewhere between the ledger and the legend, the peas won. The rule was simple, and it was absolute. Nothing belongs to you. In the earliest Benedictine communities, and later among the Franciscans, a person entering the monastery gave up ownership of everything, down to the clothes on their back. The habit they wore, the tools they used, the cell they slept in, all of it belonged to the community, never to the individual inside it. This was not merely a lifestyle of hardship. It was a specific legal and spiritual arrangement, and it produced a strange result. While each monk or friar owned nothing personally, the monasteries themselves often grew wealthy, sometimes extraordinarily so. They held farmland, they ran mills, breweries, scriptoriums, workshops. Some became the largest landholders in their region, with income streams that outlasted kings. The Benedictine Abbey of Cluny, in what is now France, grew so prosperous that its church was for a time the largest building in Europe. None of this wealth belonged to any single monk. It belonged to the institution, held in trust across generations of men who individually possessed nothing at all. Historians who study monastic economies point to a mechanism worth sitting with. Because no member could accumulate private wealth, there was no mechanism for that wealth to leak out through inheritance, dowries, or personal spending. Whatever the community earned, the community kept. And what the community kept, it could reinvest in land, in buildings, in the slow compounding business of running a farm or a vineyard across centuries rather than a single lifetime. A vow designed to remove the temptation of private accumulation ended up creating something like an early accidental engine for institutional accumulation instead. The individual renounced, the institution endured. It is worth noting that the vow was taken seriously, and not always easily. Monastic records from the period show ongoing concern, even anxiety, about members who tried to hold back small private possessions, a coin, a book, a keepsake, in violation of their vow. The rule required constant tending. It did not enforce itself. What one gives up alone, an institution can quietly keep for 1,000 years. In the late 1960s, a Stanford researcher named Walter Mischel sat young children down, one at a time, in a plain room with a single marshmallow on a plate. He told each child they could eat the marshmallow now, or wait alone for several minutes and receive a second one as a reward for waiting. The children fidgeted, covered their eyes, sat on their hands, sang to themselves. Some waited, many did not. Decades later, Mischel and his colleagues followed up with some of the original children, now adults, and reported that the ones who had waited longer tended to show better outcomes on certain measures much later in life. That follow-up is what most people remember. It became one of the most cited findings in popular psychology, the idea that a 4-year-old's ability to resist a marshmallow could forecast the shape of their entire future. That popular claim has not held up well. The original study was small, drawn overwhelmingly from children of Stanford faculty and staff, a narrow and privileged slice of one community. In 2018, a researcher named Tyler Watts, working with colleagues, ran a much larger and more socioeconomically diverse reanalysis of the marshmallow test. Their sample included far more children from lower-income households than Mischel's original group ever had. The finding, once a child's family income and background were statistically accounted for, Most of the original effect on later outcomes disappeared. The marshmallow test was not on its own the powerful crystal ball it had been made out to be. What it had likely been measuring, at least in part, was something closer to the stability or instability of the household a child went home to each night, whether promises of more, later, were things that child had learned to trust. The test itself remains a real and carefully documented experiment. Children did sit in that room, some did wait, and some did not. But the leap from that small room to a confident prediction about a life did not replicate at scale, and the larger, more careful research that followed has quietly taken most of the credit back. A single marshmallow, it turns out, was never really about the marshmallow at all. In 1978, a researcher named Philip Brickman and his colleagues tracked down 22 recent lottery winners and compared them to a control group of non-winners, asking both how happy they were with their daily lives. The winners, the study found, were not measurably happier. That finding has been repeated in books, talks, and articles ever since, as though it were the final settled word on money and happiness. 22 people is a small sample from which to draw a lesson repeated for nearly 50 years. The original study also measured happiness at a single point in time, without much data on how each winner had felt before their win, or how they might come to feel years afterward. Researchers who have revisited the question since have complicated the tidy original story considerably. Long-term panel datasets, large surveys that track the same individuals and households over many years, including detailed income and life satisfaction records collected in Germany, have found that lottery winners do report raised satisfaction after a win, at least for some period of time afterward. The size and durability of that effect is still debated among the researchers who study it, and results vary depending on how much was won and how satisfaction is measured. But the confident, simple claim that lottery winners end up no happier than anyone else has not held up as cleanly as its popularity would suggest. What makes the story interesting is not really the lottery. It is how much cultural weight got placed on a result drawn from 22 people decades ago, and how comfortably that result settled into common wisdom, repeated far more often than it was checked. The line about unhappy lottery winners is memorable. It is tidy. It fits a story many people already wanted to believe about money and its limits. Later research, working with far larger datasets and years of follow-up, found otherwise, or at least found it more complicated than the original small study ever could have shown. The 22 winners of 1978 have long since faded from view. The story built on them has outlived the evidence for it many times over. Benjamin Franklin is remembered for a tidy line: "A penny saved is a penny earned." He never quite wrote it that way. In his 1737 edition of Poor Richard's Almanac, the actual phrase was "a penny saved is 2 pence clear," a claim about avoiding cost, not about generating income. 2 pence clear meant 2 pence free and unencumbered, money that did not have to be earned back through labor or taxed away through spending, because it had never left your hand in the first place. Franklin, who ran his own print shop and understood the ledger side of business as well as anyone in colonial Philadelphia, seems to have been careful about that distinction. Saving a penny and earning a penny are not mechanically the same event, and Franklin's own writing reflects that difference rather than blurring it. 2 decades later, in 1758, he published a similar line again, this time as "a penny saved is a penny got," closer to the version people know today, but still not quite it. Got is not earned. In neither of his own versions did Franklin actually use the word earned. The phrase did not begin with him either. Similar lines about the value of thrift appear in English books roughly a century before Franklin was born, with versions traceable to the 1630s, long before Poor Richard existed on any page. Franklin was working within an established tradition of proverb collecting and refining, not inventing a saying from nothing. His real contribution was compressing an old idea into a sharper, more quotable shape, twice, in 2 slightly different versions, across 21 years. Neither of those 2 versions is the one that lasted. Sometime after Franklin, the saying was smoothed further still into the cleaner, more symmetrical penny saved, penny earned, a line that trades away the earlier, more precise idea about avoided cost for the simpler music of 2 matching words. It is the version now stitched onto samplers and printed on mugs, attributed confidently to a man who, as far as the historical record shows, never actually wrote it down. The tidier the quote, the further it has usually drifted from the person it is credited to. In 1958, Warren Buffett paid $31,500 for a gray stucco house on Farnham Street in Omaha. He has lived in it ever since, more than 60 years now, through decades in which his personal fortune grew into the tens of billions. The house has 5 bedrooms. It sits without gates, without a long private driveway, without the visible fortifications that tend to surround the homes of the very wealthy. Neighbors have described being able to walk or drive past it much as they would any other house on the street. Buffett has spoken about the purchase publicly on several occasions over the years, generally in modest terms. He has called it one of the better decisions he ever made, though not for its financial return. The house appreciated over the decades, as most real estate in a stable neighborhood does, but its value to him was never framed, by his own account, primarily in those terms. This is not a story about how the fortune was built. The methods, decisions, and decades of business behind Buffett's wealth are a separate and much longer story, told elsewhere in far more detail than a single house could carry. This is a smaller and more contained fact. One early decision about where to live, made in 1958 by a man in his 20s, and never revisited afterward, regardless of what happened to the number attached to his name in the years that followed. Most people who acquire significant wealth eventually move to larger homes, different neighborhoods, more visible addresses. He did not. The house has been the subject of tours, documentaries, and no small amount of curiosity over the years, precisely because it stayed so unchanged while everything around its owner scaled up. It is worth roughly a tiny fraction of 1% of his total net worth today, a gap that has only widened, year by year, as one number moved, and the other stayed exactly where it was. 60 years later, the house is still just a house. The word budget did not start out as anything financial. It comes from the Old French bousier, meaning a small leather bag or pouch, the sort of thing a traveler might carry papers or coins in, nothing more specific than that. English borrowed the word in that same modest sense, a small case or wallet, and for roughly 300 years, that was all it meant. The shift happened in Britain sometime in the 1700s, tied to a very literal object. The leather satchel the Chancellor of the Exchequer carried into Parliament, containing the government's papers on taxation and spending for the year ahead. When the Chancellor rose to present the government's financial plans, commentators of the day began joking that he was about to open his budget, treating the announcement itself as though it were the unbuckling of the bag. The joke caught on, then outlasted itself. Within a matter of decades, the word had drifted from the container to the contents, and then further still, from the papers inside the bag to the financial plan those papers described. Trace it back further and the trail runs through Latin to boga, a word for a leather bag or knapsack, which is itself thought to have Gaulish roots, a language once spoken across ancient Gaul, roughly modern France, before Latin displaced it. A word for luggage carried by travelers on foot eventually became the term nations used to describe how they plan to raise and spend money over an entire year. Nothing about a satchel, and nothing about spoken Gaulish or Old French would suggest on its own where the word was headed. The leather bag itself is long gone from the story. No modern chancellor still walks into a legislative chamber carrying a physical pouch to open in front of witnesses, though some, in a nod to the old joke, still carry a ceremonial case for photographs on budget day. What remains is only the word, still faintly shaped like the object it used to name, a small bag folded invisibly into a much larger idea. Every household budget still carries somewhere in its name the ghost of a satchel. Long before anything resembling a modern bank existed, cultures scattered across the ancient Near East arrived, apparently on their own, and a strikingly similar habit, sectioning off a fixed tenth of income or produce, set aside as a matter of routine. The practice shows up in temple records from Mesopotamia, in religious law recorded in ancient Israel, and in household and agricultural practice across a wider stretch of the ancient world, among peoples who had limited direct contact with one another and no shared central authority instructing them to do so. What makes the pattern notable is not the religious framing that later became attached to it in many of these cultures, but the mechanical shape underneath that framing. A tenth, set aside on a fixed schedule, after each harvest, at each transaction, at some regular interval, functions less like a religious tax and more like one of the oldest documented examples of an automatic, proportional set-aside, a portion separated from the whole before the rest could be spent, consumed, or otherwise absorbed into daily use. Mesopotamian temple and palace records describe tithes of grain and livestock, delivered on a fixed schedule as an administrative and economic routine, not merely a spiritual gesture. Ancient Israelite law, recorded across several books of the Hebrew Bible, describes multiple, sometimes overlapping tithe obligations tied to agricultural produce, some of which supported religious officials and others of which supported communal welfare. Historians and anthropologists who study the tithe across these separate traditions have long been struck by the convergence on the same number. 10 is a natural fraction for a base 10 counting system built on human fingers, which may partly explain why so many unconnected societies landed near it independently rather than through direct cultural borrowing. Still, the consistency is notable, a fixed proportional set-aside, repeated across cultures with no shared texts and no shared administration, all arriving near the same fraction of the whole. Separated by mountains, languages, and centuries, they still kept landing on the same tenth. In the 1920s, the American economist Irving Fisher spent a great deal of professional energy trying to correct what he considered a widespread and stubborn public error. People, he argued, judge their financial well-being by the raw number printed on a paycheck or written on a bill, rather than by what that number can actually purchase. A raise that fails to keep pace with rising prices, he wrote, is not really a raise at all, it only feels like one. He published the argument at length under the title The Money Illusion. Fisher was a serious and, by that point in his career, well-established economist, known for work on interest rates and the mathematics of exchange. But the money illusion was not a technical curiosity to him. He saw it as a confusion with real consequences, one capable of shaping how workers negotiated wages, how businesses set prices, and how entire economies absorbed inflation without the people living through it fully registering what was happening to their own purchasing power. $1 in his account was not a fixed unit of value. It was a shifting one, dressed up to look fixed by the flat, unchanging shape of the number itself. The confusion he described has proven remarkably persistent. Modern behavioral economists, working decades after Fisher, have documented the same pattern repeatedly in laboratory and survey settings. People asked to judge the fairness of a wage change respond very differently to a pay cut during stable prices than to a smaller real pay cut disguised as a nominal raise during a period of inflation, even when the actual purchasing power involved is identical or worse in the second case. The number on the page carries its own weight, almost independent of what it can buy. Fisher wrote his account of the illusion nearly a century ago, in an economy of a very different shape and speed than the ones that followed it. Yet the same gap between what a number says and what it actually does keeps resurfacing, decade after decade, in economies that otherwise share almost nothing else in common with his. The number on the page rarely tells you on its own what it is actually worth. A guild boy arriving as an apprentice rarely brought money with him. He brought years instead. 5 to 7 of them was typical across medieval European crafts, and for most of that stretch, he received no wage at all, only food, a bed in his master's house, and instruction in a trade he was legally forbidden to practice on his own. The guild that governed his craft set the terms, and the terms were the same everywhere: room, board, correction when needed, and patience, in exchange for a skill that would eventually be his to sell. Independence was not granted for competence alone. At the end of his term, an apprentice typically had to produce a masterpiece, a finished piece of work, judged by the guild's senior masters as proof he could work unsupervised, and even a flawless piece did not always guarantee entry. Many guilds also charged an admission fee to become a journeyman or master, sometimes a substantial one, meaning a young man could finish his training with the right hands and still lack the money to open his own shop. Some worked years longer as a journeyman, moving between towns for wages, saving toward that final fee before he could call a workshop his own. Historians who study guild records have noted how precisely this system functioned as a kind of enforced savings account. Except the currency was time rather than coin. and the account was controlled entirely by people other than the saver. The guild decided how many years counted as enough. It decided whether the finished masterpiece was good enough. It decided, in towns across Flanders and Germany and England, how large a family's existing wealth needed to be to cover the entry fee, which meant that raw talent alone rarely opened a shop door. A poor but gifted apprentice might spend a decade acquiring a skill he could not yet afford to sell independently. The system rewarded those who could survive years of unpaid labor and still have something left over, which is another way of saying it rewarded those who did not need the wages in the first place. Behind every finished masterpiece hanging in a guild hall was a calculation nobody wrote down: how much waiting a livelihood was worth, and who could actually afford to wait that long. Before he sends his son Laertes off to France, Polonius, an aging courtier in Hamlet who talks a great deal and says less than he thinks he does, offers a short string of parting advice. Wear good clothes, but nothing flashy. Listen more than you speak. And tucked among the rest, a line about money. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for a loan often costs a person both the money and the friend, and borrowing dulls the habit of managing one's own affairs. Shakespeare did not write Polonius as a wise man. He wrote him as a windbag, a father so fond of his own advice that even his son barely hides his impatience while receiving it. And audiences at the Globe were likely meant to smile a little at how much Polonius says before Laertes can get on the boat. Yet of everything Polonius tells his son that evening, this is the line that outlived the play itself, quoted for 4 centuries by people who have never read a word of Hamlet and do not know it belongs to a character the author was gently mocking. Part of its staying power is rhythm. The line balances neatly, borrower against lender, loss of money against loss of friend, the kind of symmetrical phrasing that sticks in memory the way proverbs do. Part of it is that the sentiment predates Shakespeare by centuries. Warnings against mixing money and friendship appear in classical writers and medieval sermon literature long before 1600, and Shakespeare's genius here was less invention than compression, taking an old, scattered caution and setting it in 9 words nobody has managed to improve on since. The irony is that the play surrounding the line does not entirely endorse it. Hamlet is full of debts, obligations, and favors owed between characters who are anything but simple about money, and Polonius himself is a study in a man who talks constantly about prudence while consistently failing to live by it. The advice survived the character who gave it. A farmer in Roman Gaul digs a shallow pit behind his house, lines it with a ceramic jar, and empties a leather pouch of silver coins into it before pressing the earth back down. He tells no one, or tells only one person, and then history moves on without him. Archaeologists find hoards like this with some regularity across Europe, jars and pots packed with coins, sometimes with rings or small silver objects tucked in alongside them, buried during wars, invasions, tax panics, or simply times when a household decided its savings were safer underground than anywhere else. What makes a hoard identifiable as a hoard, rather than a coin someone simply dropped, is usually its size and its containment, a purposeful cache, not a scatter. Before anything resembling a modern bank existed, burying valuables was one of the few options available to an ordinary person with money to protect. A hidden pot in a field could not be robbed by a passing army the way an unguarded house could, and unlike a loan to a neighbor or a merchant, buried coin earned no interest but also carried no risk of default. It simply waited. Some hoards were retrieved within months, the coins spent down as ordinary money once the danger passed, which is exactly why archaeologists find far fewer of those. The hoards that survive to be excavated are, almost by definition, the ones nobody came back for, whether because the owner died before returning, fled and never made it home, or simply forgot the exact spot in a field that looks like every other field. A hoard uncovered near a battlefield or dated to a documented invasion often lets historians read a household's fear directly out of the ground, a decision made in a single afternoon by someone who expected to return and did not. The coins themselves can be dated with precision, telling researchers what was circulating, how debased a currency had become, how far trade routes reached. What they cannot tell anyone is the name of the person who dug the hole, or what happened to make the return trip impossible, The ground kept the money exactly where it was left. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and versions of the line turn up in Aesop's fables from ancient Greece, in medieval Latin proverb collections copied by monks, and in English print by at least the early 1600s, each one making the identical argument: a smaller certain gain beats a larger uncertain one. What is unusual is not the sentiment, but its persistence. Proverbs about money tend to drift and mutate as they cross borders, picking up local flavor. Yet this one has kept nearly the same shape for well over 2,000 years, as though different cultures kept arriving independently at the same picture. A bird gripped firmly in the fingers is a bird that will not fly away. Two birds glimpsed in a bush might be caught, might multiply into more, or might simply vanish the moment a hand reaches toward them. And something about that specific tension, held certainty against imagined abundance, seems to have made intuitive sense to people, regardless of century or language. Medieval versions sometimes swap the numbers or the animal entirely, a sparrow instead of a generic bird, 10 in the bush instead of 2, but the underlying structure never changed. Economists centuries later would eventually give this instinct formal names and study it under laboratory conditions, but the proverb had already done the describing long before anyone measured it. The saying earned its long life by being genuinely difficult to argue with in the moment it is invoked, even though history is equally full of people who ignored it and multiplied their birds many times over, and full of others who ignored it and lost every bird they had, hand and bush alike. No version of the proverb tells you which kind of person you are before you have already reached toward the bush. Ancient Israelite law drew a hard line through every 7 days. On the seventh, work stopped. Not slowed, not lightened, stopped. And the rule bound landowners and their hired laborers alike, applying regardless of how much of the harvest still stood in the field or how close a job was to finished. The Sabbath, from a Hebrew root meaning to cease or rest, was written into the calendar itself, rather than left to individual discretion, which made it something genuinely unusual for its time. Neighboring societies across the ancient Near East had religious festivals and periodic holidays, but a fixed, weekly universal halt to labor, applying to the powerful and the powerless in the same household on the same day, had no real parallel among them. Agricultural life in the ancient world ran on a fairly unforgiving logic. Crops ripen on their own schedule, animals need daily tending, and a hired hand who did not work often did not eat. Building a mandatory pause into that system, one that a servant could claim as firmly as a landowner, inserted a strange kind of economic ceiling into an otherwise open-ended relationship between labor and survival. A master could not simply extract one more day of output because the harvest was urgent or the season short. The day was closed for business by law, not by mutual convenience. Historians of the ancient world have pointed out how unusual this looks against the economic backdrop of the time. Since most pre-modern labor systems assumed that rest was something earned only after obligations were met, a reward doled out at the discretion of whoever held the power in the arrangement. The Sabbath inverted that logic. Rest came first, built into the structure of the week itself, whether or not the granary was full or the debts were settled. It did not ask permission from output. Whatever else the Sabbath was for, worship, family, community, it also functioned as a standing interruption to the assumption that more labor always means more security, a weekly reminder that the ledger could simply be closed for a day without the world ending. The fields waited. They always had. Adam Smith is remembered today mostly for pins, division of labor, and the invisible hand, the parts of the wealth of nations that get quoted in economics classrooms. Less remembered is a smaller observation he made almost in passing, that merchants who had built what he called a competence, his word for a sufficient fortune, one large enough to live comfortably and securely, tended to change how they behaved with money. They took fewer large risks. They moved capital into steadier, less ambitious ventures. Some stopped expanding altogether and settled into managing what they already had. Smith was writing about 18th century trade, about ship owners and merchants weighing another risky voyage against the safety of what they had already banked. But the pattern he described was psychological as much as economic. Ambition in his account was not a constant force pushing indefinitely in one direction. It had a kind of natural ceiling that shifted depending on how secure a person already felt. And once that ceiling was reached, ambition tended to loosen its grip rather than tighten it. A competence in Smith's usage was not a small word for a small thing. It meant enough, a fortune sufficient to remove the fear that had been driving the risk-taking in the first place. And Smith seemed to treat the arrival at that point as a genuine turn in a person's financial life, not merely a pause. The word itself has drifted since his time, narrowing in modern English to mean skill or capability rather than a sum of money, so that a reader today has to be told what Smith meant by it before the observation makes sense at all. What he was really describing, stripped of its 18th century vocabulary, was the moment the engine of ambition changes gears on its own, without anyone deciding it should. He never fully explained why some merchants reached that moment and stopped, while others, with fortunes several times larger, kept sailing into greater risk regardless. Enough, it turns out, was never a fixed number, even in Smith's own account of it. In Britain across the 18th and 19th centuries, a gentleman's income arrived by post in the form of rent, collected from tenant farmers who worked land his family had often held for generations, and the money required nothing further from him. He did not have to appear at a shop, keep a ledger, or answer to a customer. That absence of labor was, within his class, the entire point. A gentleman who took up paid employment, especially in trade or retail, risked something sharper than disapproval. He risked being quietly understood by his own social circle as having stepped down a rung, regardless of how much money the work actually brought in. Professions like law, the military officer corps, and the clergy carried enough inherited prestige to remain acceptable. But shopkeeping, manufacturing, or any occupation that looked too much like commerce sat lower on a scale that had very little to do with income, and almost everything to do with the source of it. Money earned through labor and money collected through land ownership were treated as fundamentally different substances, even when the sums were identical. The arrangement produced a class defined less by wealth itself than by a specific relationship to work. Enough capital, in the form of land, to generate income without requiring the owner's daily presence or effort. Younger sons without inheritance faced a narrower set of acceptable paths, and daughters generally had no independent path to income at all, which meant the entire structure rested on birth order and family land as much as on money. Novelists of the period, working within and often quietly critiquing this world, filled their pages with characters whose entire social anxiety traces back to this single division, earned versus unearned, working versus idle, and whether a fortune's origin mattered more than its size. Looked at from one angle, it was a life of considerable ease, insulated from the daily uncertainty that shaped most people's relationship to money. Looked at from the other side of the property line, by the tenant farmer whose rent paid for that ease and who had no comparable path upward, regardless of effort, it looked like something considerably less peaceful than leisure. Before nest egg meant anything about money, it meant an actual egg, sometimes real, sometimes a carved or painted decoy, placed in a hen's nest by a farmer, hoping to encourage her to keep laying in that same spot rather than wandering off to nest somewhere less convenient. The trick worked on a simple instinct. A hen seeing an egg already there was more likely to add to it than to start a new nest from nothing. There was no metaphor intended, no connection to money or savings, just a small piece of practical farmyard management, passed down through generations of people who kept chickens. The leap from henhouse to household finances happened gradually, as English speakers noticed how neatly the mechanism mapped onto saving. A person who set aside an initial sum, however small, seemed more likely to keep adding to it than someone who started with nothing at all, the existing balance functioning the same way the decoy egg did, a kind of anchor that attracted more of its own kind, simply by already being there. By the 18th century, the phrase had drifted firmly into financial use, describing money deliberately set aside and left alone to grow, distinct from money kept for ordinary spending. The word choice mattered. An egg is not cash sitting idle. An egg is the beginning of something, a seed sum, which is likely why the term stuck so much more firmly than plainer alternatives like savings or reserve ever did. It carried an image of quiet accumulation built in, the sense of a thing left undisturbed, specifically so it could become more than it started as. Few people who use the phrase today have ever kept hens or placed a decoy egg in a nest box, and the agricultural trick itself has mostly faded from common practice. The words outlasted the world that made them, carrying a picture of henhouses and quiet mornings into conversations about retirement accounts and bank balances that have nothing to do with birds at all. Long before it became a stock phrase in investment writing, the warning against putting all your eggs in one basket appeared in print in Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote in 1605. It is Sancho Panza who says it, not as strategy, but as the kind of thing a practical man tells another practical man. He is not managing a portfolio, he is talking about eggs. The image survives 4 centuries later, mostly unchanged, still doing the same modest job it did in Cervantes' Spain, reminding someone that a single accident should not be able to ruin everything at once. What makes the proverb durable is how little it asks of the listener. It does not require numbers, or a theory of markets, or any specialized vocabulary. A basket falls, every egg in it breaks. That is the whole argument, and it is complete without a single abstraction. Variants of the same image turn up independently in other languages and other centuries, which suggests less borrowing than convergence. Different cultures arriving separately at the same small domestic disaster, because the disaster itself is so easy to picture. Spanish, English, Italian, and later American writers all reach for baskets and eggs rather than ships or fields or coin, though those images were equally available to them. Eggs are fragile in a way almost nothing else in a farmhouse is. They break completely, not partially, and they break the moment the basket does, all at once, with no chance to react in between. By the time the phrase crosses into English financial writing, centuries after Sancho Panza first said it, it has already done its real work as folk wisdom passed between people who owned baskets and chickens and little else. The financial world did not invent the caution. It borrowed a peasant's sentence and put a necktie on it. What changed was the audience, not the idea. Bankers and economists eventually needed the same warning that any Spanish villager already carried in his head, without needing to write it down. A basket, after all, holds together right up until the instant it does not. Offered a smaller reward today, or a larger one in a month, most people take the smaller one now. Offered the same choice with both dates pushed a year into the future instead, the same people usually switch and choose to wait for the larger reward. Nothing about the math has changed. The gap between the two dates is identical either way. Only the starting point moved. Researchers call this pattern present bias. A delay feels far more costly when it begins immediately than when it is equally long, but sits further off in time. It shows up reliably across laboratory studies, across cultures, across age groups, in choices involving money, food, and effort alike. Ask someone to choose between $1,100 in a year or $1,200 in 13 months, and patience wins easily. A 1-month wait, tacked onto a year that is already passing anyway, barely registers. Ask the same person to choose between $1,100 today or $1,200 in 1 month, and the extra month suddenly feels large, even though it is the exact same length of time being weighed against the exact same extra $100. The only thing that changed is whether the clock starts now or later. Economists sometimes describe this using curves and discount rates, models built to explain why the present exerts a pull that no future moment seems to match. But the plainer way to say it is that now has a weight later dates simply do not carry. A month that has not started yet is easy to reason about calmly, almost abstractly, the way a person might discuss someone else's schedule. A month that starts the instant a decision is made feels entirely different, immediate, textured, already underway in the imagination. The waiting itself seems to cost something extra when it begins today, some toll charged only at the front end of a delay, though no such toll appears anywhere in the actual numbers. What is strange is not that people are impatient, but that the same stretch of time, unchanged in length, can feel almost negligible in one telling and nearly unbearable in another, depending only on which day it happens to start counting from. The Shaker religious communities of 19th century America held all property communally. Members owned nothing individually, not land, not tools, not the clothes on their backs, all of it belonging to the community as a whole. Personal wealth in the ordinary sense did not exist inside a Shaker village. And yet, Shaker furniture workshops became so well regarded for quality that Shaker goods were sold commercially across the country, prized by buyers who had no interest in the theology behind them and probably no knowledge of it at all. Their chairs, oval boxes, brooms, and tools earned a reputation that had nothing to do with charity or curiosity, and everything to do with how well the objects worked. A shaker chair was built to be sturdy, light, and unornamented, with joints that held and proportions that made sense for the body sitting in it. The famous plainness was not a marketing choice. It came directly from religious conviction, a belief that unnecessary decoration was a form of vanity, a distraction from the honest use of a thing. Shakers built as though every object might be inspected by God, which turned out, almost incidentally, to be excellent training for building objects that satisfied paying customers who cared only about durability and fit. The contradiction sits right at the center of shaker economic life. A community organized specifically to reject personal wealth turned out to be extremely good at making things other people wanted to buy, and sold enough of them to sustain villages that by design wanted for very little else. There was no profit motive driving the workshop floor, no individual craftsman angling for a bonus or a promotion, no piecework wage attached to output. What drove the quality was closer to devotion than commerce, and yet commerce is exactly where that devotion ended up finding its market. Outside buyers did not need to share the theology to recognize the workmanship, and shaker communities, indifferent to individual profit, were still perfectly capable of running workshops that turned a communal surplus. Whatever produced the chairs clearly was not the promise of getting rich from them, which makes the money they earned almost beside the point. In 1955, the writer C. Northcote Parkinson published an essay arguing that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. He was describing bureaucracy, a government office where a simple task could stretch to consume an entire afternoon simply because an entire afternoon had been allotted to it, with committees, memos, and procedure filling every available hour, regardless of how much the task actually required. It was satire, sharp and specific to office life, aimed at civil servants and paperwork, not at anyone's personal budget. The essay found its afterlife somewhere else entirely. Parkinson and later writers extended the same shape of observation into a second law, that expenses tend to rise to consume almost all of whatever income becomes available to spend them. A raise arrives, and within months, the household budget has absorbed it so thoroughly that no visible surplus remains. The money seemingly gone before its owner can quite say where. It is the same structure as the original joke, a task swelling to match its allotted time, applied now to spending instead of paperwork. Nothing forces this to happen. No mechanism requires a raise to vanish into new expenses. Yet it turns up again and again in household budgets, closely enough that the extended version of Parkinson's law is now, for most people, more familiar than the original essay it came from. Why a joke about office bureaucracy ended up describing kitchen tables and bank statements instead is its own small puzzle. Perhaps it is simply that both patterns share a common root: the tendency of any flexible resource, hours or dollars, to be absorbed entirely by whatever expands to meet it, without anyone consciously deciding to let that happen. A larger paycheck brings, almost invisibly, a larger set of things that now feel necessary, the way a longer afternoon brings, just as invisibly, a longer meeting. Parkinson himself was aiming his pen at typists and memoranda. He would likely have been amused, and perhaps a little proud, to find his real legacy sitting on the personal finance shelf of a bookstore, instead of beside the histories of civil service. Somewhere a raise arrives and a new subscription appears within the month, and neither one remembers meeting the other. In 1769, the philosopher Denis Diderot received an elegant new scarlet dressing gown as a gift. It was a fine thing, well cut, richly colored, clearly better than anything else in his study. Within weeks, he had replaced his desk, his chair, his prints, and most of his old furniture, all of it suddenly looking shabby beside the one new object sitting among them. Nothing else in the room had changed, only the gown was new, and yet the gown alone was enough to make everything around it look wrong. Diderot wrote an essay about the experience, a wry little account of watching his own study transform itself piece by piece around a single gift he had not asked for. He missed his old gown, he admitted, the plain, worn, comfortable one that had matched the plain, worn, comfortable disorder of his study before the scarlet robe arrived. That old gown had suited a room full of mismatched, familiar, slightly shabby things. The new one suited nothing, so everything else had to be upgraded until it did. He described himself as a man now surrounded by a kind of forced elegance he had never intended to acquire, poorer for the gift in every practical sense, despite owning, on paper, finer things than before. Roughly 2 centuries later, economists and writers borrowed Diderot's small domestic story and gave it a name, describing the wider pattern of one new possession quietly demanding that everything around it be upgraded to match. A new sofa makes the rug look tired. A new phone makes the case look cheap. The pattern Diderot lived through in his own study in the 1760s, one object exposing every other object's age, turned out to describe something people kept recognizing in their own homes long after his gown had gone to dust. The mechanism he described was psychological, not financial at its root. New items do not merely sit beside old ones, they redefine what the old ones look like by comparison, and the comparison rarely flatters what came before. He kept the gown in the end, but he never quite forgave it. Medieval craft guilds commonly maintained a shared box or chest, kept under lock in the guild hall, funded by regular dues that every member paid in over time. Into that chest went the coins that would, eventually, come back out again to support members who fell sick, were injured on the job, or died, leaving behind widows and children the guild had, in effect, already promised to look after. No single member paid for his own future misfortune alone. The whole membership paid steadily, together, into a pool that any one of them might need to draw from someday, though most hoped never to. The arrangement functioned as an early form of mutual aid, operating centuries before insurance existed as a formal industry with its own companies and contracts. A weaver who broke a hand, a mason who fell from scaffolding, a widow whose husband had spent 30 years paying his dues faithfully, all of them could turn to the same chest, the same guild hall, the same shared pool of coin that had been quietly accumulating from ordinary dues long before any particular emergency required it. Burial costs, too, were often covered from the fund, sparing families a debt they might not otherwise have been able to meet. The chest did not distinguish between misfortunes. Sickness, injury, old age, and death all drew from the same source, spread thin enough across an entire trade that no single tragedy could bankrupt the guild that carried it. What made the system work was structural, not sentimental, however much the guilds may also have framed it, in the language of brotherhood and mutual obligation. Every member paid in whether or not he ever expected to need the money, and the steady accumulation of small regular dues meant the fund could absorb the occasional large claim without collapsing. It was risk, pooled and spread, centuries before actuaries or insurance companies existed, to formalize the idea into policies and premiums. The Guildhall chest asked for a small, certain, and repeated sacrifice in exchange for protection against a larger, uncertain, and far more painful one. The lock on that chest protected more than coin. Quaker merchants in 18th century Britain and colonial Philadelphia became known for refusing to haggle. They posted a single fixed price for their goods and expected every customer, however wealthy or poor, however skilled a bargainer, to pay exactly that price and nothing else. A servant and a lord paid the same amount for the same bolt of cloth. No exceptions were made for charm, persistence, or standing. The practice ran directly against nearly all conventional trading custom of the period, in which prices were assumed to be negotiable between buyer and seller as a matter of course, haggling itself treated as a normal and even expected part of any transaction. Bargaining was how a fair price got found, most merchants would have said. Each sale a small negotiation between two people trying to read each other. Quakers rejected the entire premise. Their refusal to haggle grew out of religious conviction about plainness and honesty in dealing with others. The belief that offering two different customers two different prices for an identical article involved a kind of dishonesty, a willingness to charge whatever a given buyer could be made to pay, rather than what the goods were actually worth. One price meant one truth, told the same way to everyone who walked through the door. Over time, the practice became something more than a religious scruple. Customers who disliked haggling, who found the whole ritual of negotiation exhausting or unpredictable, increasingly sought Quaker shops out on purpose, knowing exactly what they would be charged before they ever asked. A buyer unfamiliar with the going rate for a good easily taken advantage of under the old system, could walk into a Quaker shop with some confidence that the price on offer was the same one offered to everyone else. Word of that consistency spread the way word of any dependable thing spreads, customer to customer, and it became, whether intended or not, a genuine commercial advantage in towns where trust between strangers could not always be assumed. Reputation, it turned out, could be spent like currency, and Quaker merchants had simply worked out how to keep earning it. In 1716, Britain created its first sinking fund, a dedicated pool of surplus government revenue set aside for one purpose only: paying down the national debt. The idea came from Walpole, and it arrived while the country was still staggering under the cost of decades of war. The logic was simple, and on paper almost elegant. Interest was refinanced at lower rates, the savings were funneled into the fund, and the fund would quietly buy back government debt year after year until the burden shrank to nothing. For a while, it worked close to as intended. The fund grew, debt retired, and the mechanism did roughly what its designers had promised. Then Parliament began to notice that the fund was, in practical terms, a large and growing pile of money sitting under government control. A war needed financing, a subsidy needed covering, a shortfall somewhere else needed a quiet patch. Each time, the surplus meant for old debt got redirected towards some newer, more pressing need, and each redirection came with its own reasonable-sounding justification. No single decision looked like betrayal. Every one of them looked like prudence, given the circumstances of the moment. Walpole himself, later in his career, presided over some of these very reigns, a detail historians have long noted with a certain dry amusement. The fund technically continued to exist for more than a century, revived and reformed under different chancellors with different names, each revival promising that this time the discipline would hold. It rarely held for long. The pattern repeats with a consistency that outlasted any single administration. A purpose-built pool of money survives only as long as nothing more urgent comes along, and something more urgent always comes along. By the time the original sinking fund was finally abolished in the 1820s, it had spent most of its life being borrowed from, rather than being used to lend. What endures from the experiment is not the debt it retired, but the shape of the temptation it revealed, one that had nothing to do with the 18th century in particular. In a 1714 poem, the physician and satirist Bernard Mandeville imagined a hive of bees living in loud, thriving prosperity, every one of them driven by greed, vanity, envy, and appetite. Trade flourished, craftsmen prospered, lawyers profited from disputes, doctors from illness, soldiers from war, and the whole teeming hive rattled along in what Mandeville called a kind of paradise, wealthy and busy, and by any conventional standard, deeply corrupt. Then, in his poem, the bees got what they thought they wanted. Jove granted their prayer for virtue, and vice vanished from the hive overnight. Bees stopped overspending. Lawyers found no more quarrels to settle. Merchants stopped puffing up their goods with flattering lies, and the hive, freed of all its vice, collapsed. Without wanting more than they needed, without vanity to chase or envy to outrun, the bees had no reason to buy, sell, build, or hire. Prosperity had been running on exactly the appetites virtue was supposed to cure. The poem was called The Fable of the Bees, and its subtitle stated the argument outright: private vices, public benefits. Mandeville was not exactly praising vice, he was needling a comfortable assumption of his era, the idea that a nation could be both maximally virtuous and maximally prosperous at the same time, with no friction between the two. His contemporaries were furious. The book was presented to a grand jury in Middlesex as a public nuisance, condemned from pulpits, and denounced by moralists who accused him of corrupting readers by pretending that greed built cities. Few of them managed to refute the mechanism he described, only the impropriety of describing it at all. What Mandeville had actually done was point at something ordinary and uncomfortable, that wanting more, spending on things not strictly needed, and competing for status were not separate from a functioning economy, but woven into its machinery. Economists a century later would revisit his argument more soberly, stripped of the satire, and find the bones of it still standing. The hive he imagined never got its virtue and its honey at once. The English word miser comes directly from the Latin miser, which meant nothing about money at all. It simply meant wretched or unfortunate, a word for someone in a state of suffering. Roman writers used it for the sick, the grieving, the unlucky, anyone life had treated harshly. For centuries after the word entered English, it carried that same broad weight of misery, unattached to spending habits of any kind. The narrowing happened slowly. By the 16th century, English writers had begun using miser in a more specific way, to describe someone gripped by an excessive, joyless hoarding of wealth, unwilling to spend, even when spending was easily afforded. The shift makes a strange kind of sense once you sit with it. A person clutching money they refuse to use, refusing warmth, food, or comfort they can plainly pay for, look to observers like someone in the grip of a private, self-inflicted wretchedness. The old word for general suffering attached itself to this one particular and visible form of it. For a long stretch of that transition, the two meanings overlapped so closely that calling someone miserable and calling them a miser were nearly interchangeable accusations. Both described a person diminished, in one case by circumstance, in the other by a hoarding compulsion that circumstance did nothing to explain. Only gradually did English split the word in two, miserable drifting back toward general unhappiness, miser narrowing until it meant almost exclusively a person unreasonably attached to unspent wealth. The drift is worth sitting with. Somewhere in that history, a culture decided that extreme thrift was not simply a personality trait or a quirk of temperament, but a form of suffering, one worth naming with the same word used for grief and misfortune. There is little tenderness left in the word today. Modern usage treats the miser as a figure of mockery more than pity, a cautionary cartoon rather than a wretched man. But the word remembers something its current users mostly do not. That hoarding, in the language that first named it, was never filed under cleverness, it was filed under sorrow. In April 1888, a French newspaper printed the wrong obituary. The inventor Alfred Nobel's brother, Ludwig, had just died in Cannes, and somewhere in the confusion of the report, a French paper ran an obituary for Alfred himself instead, very much alive at the time. The popular story that has circulated ever since holds that the obituary judged him harshly, branding him a merchant of death for his fortune built on dynamite and explosives, and that reading his own premature damning epitaph shook him badly enough to rewrite his will and fund a prize for peace. Parts of this are documented fact. The mix-up itself happened. The newspaper Le Figaro published the erroneous obituary and corrected the error the following day. Nobel did, several years later, leave the bulk of his fortune to establish the Nobel Prizes, including one specifically for peace. Both of those things are real and traceable in the historical record. The phrase merchant of death, however, does not appear to be true, at least not as part of that actual 1888 obituary. Historians who have gone looking for it in the surviving text have not found the original source of the quote, no matter how often it gets repeated. The earliest known appearance of the dramatic phrase and the dramatic reaction it supposedly caused shows up decades later in a biography written well after Nobel's death, and it appears to be a later invention, a vivid detail added to give a plain administrative mix-up the shape of a moral awakening. What actually motivated Nobel's will remains less cinematic and more human, a wealthy, famously private man without children, increasingly troubled by how his explosives were being used in warfare, choosing near the end of his life to direct his fortune toward science, literature, and peace, rather than toward heirs. That choice needed no invented newspaper scare to explain it. The real story lost its punchline somewhere along the way, and a better one grew up to replace it. In the year 305, the Roman Emperor Diocletian did something almost no emperor before him had done. He stepped down from power voluntarily at the height of his authority, with no assassin's blade or rival army forcing his hand, and retired to a palace he had built for himself on the Dalmatian coast in what is now Croatia. There, by every surviving account, he spent his remaining years growing vegetables. He had reorganized the entire Roman Empire during his reign, splitting its rule among co-emperors to make an unwieldy territory governable, and he left that system in the hands of men he had personally chosen to succeed him. It did not go smoothly. Within a few years, his successors were fighting among themselves for control, and the succession crisis grew serious enough that former colleagues traveled to Diogenes' retirement palace to beg him to return, put his old authority back on, and settle the chaos he had left behind. He refused. He is said to have replied in effect that if they could see the cabbages he had planted with his own hands, they would never think to ask him to trade this life for a throne again. No document from his own hand records the line precisely, and it comes down through later historians rather than his own pen. But it fits everything else known about a man who chose an ending almost nobody else in his position ever chose. Roman power did not typically get handed back. It got seized, inherited, or pried loose by force. Diogenes set his down on his own terms and did not pick it back up, even when the empire he built came asking. The vegetables themselves are long gone, along with the exact plot of soil that grew them, though the ruins of his palace still stand at the heart of the old town of Split. What remains is the shape of the refusal, an emperor who had held more power than nearly anyone alive in his world, measuring it one day against a garden and finding the garden heavier. In Hans Holbein's 1533 painting The Ambassadors, two of the era's most powerful men stand dressed in fur and velvet, flanked by a table crowded with the finest globes, timepieces, lutes, and mathematical instruments that money could buy. Every object in the frame announces status, learning, and command over the world's measurable things. And stretched across the floor at their feet, low and strange, sits a long smeared shape that seems to belong to no object in the room at all. Viewed straight on, it reads as little more than a warped, meaningless streak. But viewed from a sharp angle, off to the side, the shape resolves suddenly into a human skull, rendered through a technique called anamorphosis, a way of distorting an image so it only assembles correctly from one precise vantage point. Holbein placed it there on purpose, tucked into a portrait otherwise dedicated entirely to wealth, status, and worldly achievement. To see it clearly, a viewer has to abandon the straight-ahead view that shows off all the fine possessions, and look instead from an angle that flattens all of it into the periphery. The two men in the painting were diplomats, not merchants, but the gesture Holbein made belonged to a much wider habit of the age. Wealthy and powerful people of the Renaissance kept small, deliberate reminders of death close at hand. A skull on a writing desk, a memento mori medallion, a painted hourglass tucked into the corner of an otherwise triumphant portrait. The Latin phrase for the custom, memento mori, translates simply as, remember you will die. It was not meant as despair. It was meant as a corrective, a small, deliberate weight placed on one side of the scale to keep the globes and velvet and timepieces from tipping it entirely. Nobody knows exactly what conversation, if any, passed between Holbein and the two ambassadors about that smeared shape on the floor. What survives is only the finished choice, a room full of every fine instrument the world could offer, and one shape that only shows itself true when you stop looking at the rest. Somewhere in the historical record, a nabob who sailed home rich in his 20s eventually grew old regardless, the fortune following him quietly into rooms that no longer needed impressing. Money, it turns out, buys distance from work far more reliably than it buys distance from time. Every figure in this hour, the ledger keepers, the retired emperors, the philosophers counting their own wants, the misers who are not quite what the newspaper said, ran into that same wall eventually, however early or late they arrived at it, however much or little they had waiting for them when they did. None of them left instructions. They left habits, scattered across centuries and languages and very different kinds of hunger, most of which they never wrote down on purpose. A ledger survives because someone kept it out of temperament, not because they meant it as a lesson for anyone else. A garden gets planted because a man wanted vegetables more than he wanted a throne, not because he was performing wisdom for a later audience. History does not offer conclusions here, so much as it offers company. A long, quiet line of people who each, in their own year and their own currency, worked out where enough began. The clerk who came home from Calcutta rich enough to stop is long dead now, and so is everyone who envied him for it. What outlasted both of them was smaller than either expected, not the fortune, which scattered the way fortunes generally do, but the habit of noticing early that a life is not the same thing as the money spent chasing it.